Good morning. I'm honored to welcome you to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a special reading and community conversation hosted by Emory's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to discuss Dr. King's powerful, enduring legacy. Today, we'll focus on excerpts from America's Chief Moral Dilemma, a speech Dr. King gave in May of 1967. And he gave that speech on the steps of Sproul Hall at the University of California, Berkeley. And those steps are so iconic because they are where the free speech movement began a few years earlier. And it is a place I'm very familiar with, having spent more than 2 decades at Berkeley. By the time Dr. King spoke in 1967, he was acclaimed as a civil rights leader, and his advocacy for nonviolence was inspiring desperately needed change across the United States. His accomplishments had already earned him international recognition as the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. It was during that historic speech that Dr. King famously decried the 3 evils, racial injustice, poverty, and war, as problems that must be solved. And as our nation today continues to grapple mightily with anti-Black racism, I know that Dr. King's call to conquer those problems remains as urgent as ever. And I'm proud that Emory offers a forum like this to celebrate the truth and the resonance of his words and his legacy. Our conversation this morning will be led by some of our finest scholars from Emory's African American Studies and History departments. Professors Valerie Babb, Dianne Stewart, and Carl Suddler. Excerpts from Dr. King's speech will be narrated today by January LaVoy, Assistant Professor of Theater Studies. My thanks to you all for your research, for your commitment and your insights, and for leading us in this important and timely dialogue.
3 major evils: the evil of racism, the evil of poverty, and the evil of war. These are the 3 things that I want to deal with today. Now, let us turn first to the evil of racism. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that racism is still alive all over America. Racial injustice is still the Negro's burden and America's shame. And we must face the hard fact that many Americans would like to have a nation which is a democracy for white Americans, but simultaneously a dictatorship over Black Americans. We must face the fact that we still have much to do in the area of race relations.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our event today. My name is Dr. Carol Henderson. I'm Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer and Advisor to the President. I want to thank each of our friends here at Emory for attending. I want to also thank our panelists and thank President Finbez for that wonderful welcome. Special thanks go to Nicole Ingram, Director of Programs and Special Initiatives, and Jessica E. Jones, the Executive Administrative Assistant for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. This is a timely event, one that will allow us to reflect and meditate on King's words and its connection to our present state. With that said, we will now begin our discussion and our recordings, and I look forward to returning with some closing reflections at the end. Thank you.
The fact is that there has never been any single, solid, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans to genuine equality for Negroes. There has always been ambivalence. In 1863, the Negro was granted freedom from physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation. But he was not given land to make that freedom meaningful. At the same time, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the Midwest and the West, which meant that the nation was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor, while refusing to do it for its black peasants from Africa who were held in slavery 244 years. And this is why Frederick Douglass would say that emancipation for the Negro was freedom to hunger, freedom to the winds and rains of heaven, freedom without roofs to cover their heads. It was freedom without bread to eat, without land to cultivate. It was freedom and famine at the same time. And it is a miracle that the Negro has survived.
Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely right. Colleagues, friends, it's a pleasure to be here to reflect on the words of Martin Luther King. It is a miracle that African Americans have survived. And as I hear these words of Dr. King, I hear an invitation to the nation and to individual American citizens to acknowledge that anti-Black racism and callous disregard for Black life are defining features of American history and heritage. And I believe these are the remarks we absolutely need to hear in America today. When I think about how Martin Luther King anticipated in this very speech that advocates of civil rights were on the verge of losing many of their supporters because what he called the second phase of civil rights activism was actually going to require the nation to invest financially in its Black citizens, I can't help but conclude that King would have been an ardent supporter of a well-conceived and carefully implemented reparations policy for descendants of racial slavery in America today.
Yeah, and to follow up on my colleague's points, right, I also think it's important for us not to lose sight of what King reminds us here, right? That while it's important to recognize progress, racial progress in particular, we mustn't lose sight of the danger in transition, right? It's in the same speech that King wrote, "The plant of freedom has grown only a bud and not yet a flower." To assume that the civil rights movement was complete in the 1960s was to ignore or fail to realize the importance of transition periods. In 67, King realized that we were moving into a new phase of the struggle, but it was far from complete. And in fact, he categorizes this transition as going from a struggle for decency or a struggle to get rid of brutality as a struggle for genuine equality, right? In 1967. And to piggyback really on what Professor Stewart was saying, these gains, and King puts this poetically, right, in his speech, but he says these gains from the first period were cheap, right? For lack of a better word. He says that they were obtained from the power structure at bargain rates. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate hotels and motels to guarantee the right to vote. But it's going to cost billions of dollars to get rid of poverty, to get rid of slums, to make a quality integrated education a reality. And this is where we are now. And, he knew these exorbitant costs actually went beyond dollars and cents as well, right? He said it will cost us friends, right? King wrote that the allies who are with us in Selma will not stay with us during this period. And we've got to understand what was happening then and what is happening now is, what King called white backlash in 1967, what our colleague calls white rage, here at Emory. But even he knew that this wasn't a new name, right? Or this was a new name for an old phenomenon. But the ambivalence in transition periods tells us so much about how far forward or backwards we will go from here.
I could not agree more with both of my colleagues, and I'm very interested in that word phase because it really signifies to me what a consistently adapting thinker that King was. And I can't help but think that were he looking at our landscape today, he would be making his statements in larger and larger global terms as well. I was struck this past summer at the international reaction to the racial violence here in the United States. People marching in Marseille, people marching at the embassy in South Korea, people marching in Pakistan. And I think so many people related to what I'll call the Black example because it is so representative of injustice everywhere. And increasingly, I think King was moving towards making that larger statement, showing how all of us are underneath someone's knee and down on the ground, no matter what part of the globe that we are from.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about what he's saying at this point is that he had the ability to reflect on the injustices that impact everyone without losing sight of the anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism that impacted African Americans. I mean, what does it mean that at the turn of the 21st century, it was estimated that roughly 46 million Americans, about a quarter of American adults, the American adult population, were descended from the more than 1.6 million white American, native-born and immigrant families that became landowners under Homestead Acts that required little more than a filing fee. King was attentive to that in the issues that he called out. African Americans got no land virtually during Reconstruction, while the nation was giving land away to white Americans, including immigrants. And so that nuance, that ability to be intersectional in his analysis, in all of his speeches and sermons, is something that we need to reflect on today and to continue to hold together. The ability to speak to the universal, but not lose sight of the particular. And I appreciate King significantly for that.
And I think that you're also hitting a very key point, is that those comments really do show us how racial ideology is built into every aspect of our nation, even land, even the landscapes around us. And it's that ideology that allows some to have more than other that becomes his central concern over and over again.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. The other thing that he makes me think about is our nation's historical approach to policy and policy implementation. I mean, certainly he's talking about policies that were implemented to allow entitlements to white Americans, and at the same time to be comfortable with continued Black impoverishment. And so I think when we look at what's happening in our nation today, I think this is really a time for everyone to reflect on Americans' history of policymaking and policy implementation and the impact of American policies on African Americans, on all Americans, but on African Americans. And once again, I truly believe that we are in a time that calls for bold, revolutionary policies that can make systemic differences in African Americans' lives. And that's where King was. And we failed at that historically over the past 4 or 5 generations since his death.
Yeah, I agree. And I think key to that is also showing that there is nothing to fear from those bold steps, because those bold steps will enable everyone to live a better life.
Absolutely.
Now let us be sure that we will have to keep the pressure alive. We've never made any gain in civil rights without constant, persistent, legal, and nonviolent pressure. Don't let anybody make you feel that the problem will work itself out. The second evil that I want to deal with is the evil of poverty. Like a monstrous octopus, it spreads its nagging, prehensile tentacles into cities and hamlets and villages all over our nation. Some 40 million of our brothers and sisters are poverty-stricken, unable to gain the basic necessities of life. And so often we allow them to become invisible because our society's so affluent that we don't see the poor. Some of them are Mexican Americans, some of them are Indians, some are Puerto Ricans, some are Appalachian whites. The vast majority are Negroes in proportion to their size in the population. Now, there is nothing new about poverty. It's been with us for years and centuries. What is new at this point, though, is that we now have the resources, we now have the skills, we now have the techniques to get rid of poverty. And the question is whether our nation has the will.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, the two are always so connected, right? You know, so we let off with racism. Now we're moving into a conversation or a discussion about poverty. And I just want to start off by simply restating much of what King had to say here, because so much of this brief passage ought to resonate in the 21st century, you know, in 2021, as it did in 1967. You know, some 40 million of our brothers and sisters are poverty stricken, unable to gain the basic necessities of life. Now, put in a different speech in the same year, King realized that this fact, that this problem would actually be better served to be framed as a question. That is, why are there 40 million poor people in America? Because, and King said this is why it's pivotal that we frame King beyond King's legacy in particular, right? Beyond the kind of I have a dream moment. Because when you begin to ask that question, you are really raising questions about the economic system, right? About a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you really are questioning a capitalistic economy. And in so doing, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. Contrary to whether we'd like to admit it or not, we actually know the answer, right? And perhaps I should be a little more flexible and say we know an answer so it can be open for interpretation. But folks who study racial capitalism, right, who studied it then, who study it now, will tell you that the essence of economic inequality is born in a simple fact. There are 400 billionaires in the United States and 45 million people living in poverty, right? These aren't parallel facts, they're intersecting facts, right? As Keonga Taylor often reminds us. There are 400 American billionaires because there are 45 million people living in poverty. Profit comes at the expense of the living wage, right? And King writes that on poverty-stricken people, so often we allow them to be invisible because our society is so affluent that we don't see the poor. But this is why we challenge with questions, right? You know, we're called upon, according to King, to discourage the beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars in life's marketplace, right? It means that these questions have to be raised. And, you know, would love to hear what you guys think to come back to close it as well.
I was thinking as you were speaking that what would be the impact if those billionaires just paid their fair share of taxes? Not additional taxes necessarily, but just the taxes that they're supposed to pay. If we close loopholes, if we close the means through which you don't have to essentially live up to your debt to your American society. Because I think we think of classes, we think of caste, and forget that we are a common world. We are a common society, and we have a responsibility to fellow human beings to make sure that they are doing well. It seems trite to say, but it is very true. We all do better when everybody does better.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. I was also thinking about our thought leaders, right? Our American economists who are thinking about toxic inequality. And I was thinking about Derek Hamilton's baby bonds policy initiative, because he even says this is rooted in American rights, in economic rights, which is not new in America. So, you know, just piggybacking on what Valerie is talking about, I mean, Hamilton is arguing that if we reform tax policies, right? If we, instead of privileging existing wealth, focus on building wealth through tax policies, the landscape can change. And what I love about his baby bonds project is that it's based on the wealth of a family on a sliding scale, that every infant born in America, right, would be given some sort of trust. The wealthiest might get $500, the poorest might get $60,000, and that when that infant becomes an adult, they can draw from that investment for an asset building project. What would that mean? I mean, the ideas are there, but as King consistently said, does America have the will? And I was so interested in the fact that Cory Booker took that up as his big idea and wondered what would have happened if he had found his way into the presidency. Would we have seen that big idea implemented? But that's what we need: new, bold, courageous, humane, ethical policymakers and plans of implementation. And so once again, we have the ideas, we have the plans, but do we have the will?
And I think ethical is the key word there, Dianne. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, on that, right? Like, this is where the history matters, right? Because, the history of capitalism in this country, as many historians remind us, right, is categorized as world warring, right? It's categorized as classing, as slave trading, right? According to Ibram Kendi, right? He tells us these things in various ways over time. It's enslaving, it's colonizing, it's depressing wages, it's dispossessing land and labor and resources and rights, right? We know what capitalism has looked like in this country. The problem is any open critique of capitalism becomes labeled in a rhetorical way that becomes scary for anybody who might, go on that side, right? If you're against capitalism, you're a socialist, right? And then we look to histories of socialist country and we use them as sort of examples of what this would look like if the United States had a redistribution of its wealth. And that's just, that's a fallacy, right? That doesn't actually work. For far too many, capitalism serves, especially in this country, capitalism serves as their freedom to exploit people into economic ruin. King understood that in '67. So many of us understand that today. We use different platforms to kind of talk about these things, whether it's in the classroom, through publications, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I think it hits right on when King is like, we know we have the resources, the skills, the techniques. We know how to get rid of poverty. We've seen people get out of poverty in this country time and time again, right? We just need to, as a nation, commit to it in a systemic kind of way. Or, like King says, we need to have the will to do it.
That's right.
And I think we need to also have our popular culture and those representations reconfigure how poverty is represented. We blame people for being poor. We feel that that's some kind of moral failing because someone cannot make ends meet. And I think that is key to changing these perceptions. And the flip side of that also is we tend to associate the word welfare with a particular vision, a particular set of circumstances, and not really consider the amount of corporate welfare, the amount of welfare that goes to people with great privilege through tax cuts, through policies. And again, we particularize certain terms that really do cloud and confuse a clear understanding of what poverty is and what steps we can take to go past that.
Absolutely. I also think it's really important that King grew in his analysis of America and America's footprint around the world in terms of its materialism as the civil rights movement expanded. I mean, it's important to think about this particular speech after he had been to Chicago, right? After he had faced and seen and worked with poor Black people in the slums of Chicago, and realized that the movement, the analysis had to expand to incorporate what was happening to Black people and to other poor people in the North. It's very different than the South. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about having the opportunity to reflect upon King during this moment, because we release him from the mythical king that so many Americans are comfortable with, right? We really see his breadth and his depth, and see that his words, his vision needs to be applied today.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. 100%. If King was around today, there would be all types of labels thrown at his ideas, right? He would be a socialist in 2021, right? And what does that mean in terms of how we remember him, right? And with that being said, we also need to be careful of how we frame and categorize him of the legacy on if he was around today, as if he couldn't be around today. In fact, he's not around today because of the evolution of his thought, right? Because so much of the evolution of his thought was gaining so much traction in this space, right? The space against capitalism in particular, that it posed a different kind of threat to the system, right?
Absolutely.
The great problem and the great challenge facing mankind today is to get rid of war. We have left ourselves as a nation morally and politically isolated in the world. We have greatly strengthened the forces of reaction in America and excited violence and hatred among our own people. We have diverted attention from civil rights.
Piggybacking on what both Carl and Dianne were saying, one of the reasons I like this particular segment in the speech is because it does take us past "I have a dream" King. It reminds us of the multiple ways he was thinking all at once. We tend to popularly freeze him in time and forget all of the other issues, all of the other interconnected issues that he was also engaging with. I like to think of this segment on both the actual and the metaphorical. Actually, as King is talking about ending the Vietnam War, he is talking about mass casualties that are happening against humanity for no clear goals. He is talking about mass amounts of money that is being spent to kill humanity on with no clear goals. And I think the Vietnam War was perhaps one of the watershed moments where people were again asking, why are we doing this? I think about Muhammad Ali saying, I am not going to go kill someone who is of Asian descent for a white man who doesn't think anything of either of us. I think a lot of racial commonalities were crystallized by the Vietnam War. So I think King really saw it as a corrupt act, something that was alienating us from the rest of the world, something that was clearly diminishing our goodwill. But also, I think King was probably becoming wary with the whole concept of war as our society uses it. We always have a war in the United States. We have a war on poverty. We have a war on drugs, and they're always abject failures because when you think of an enemy and oversimplify them that easily as something that be eradicated and gotten rid of, you are not looking at the complex causes at the roots of poverty, at the roots of addiction. So I think that King would probably also begin to think about what other metaphors can we use to channel our passion, to channel our energies, to make the urgencies of these situations clearer than this oversimplification of a war on, and let's get the appropriate czar to be the leader. And usually that czar is absolutely clueless.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Babb took the words right out of my mouth, right? Like, I mean, there obviously when King is saying that we have greatly strengthened the forces of reaction in America and incited violence and hatred among our own people, there is a particular focus here on militarism, right? That's geared toward the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is happening at a time when war appears to be endless, right? And on the verge of expanding. But built into that moment is also movements, right? Movements for women's liberation, the gay liberation movement, the broader scope of the civil rights movement. And all of these movements are facing wars at home, whether it's going to be the war on poverty, the war on crime, the impending war on drugs. That language of war, that language of militarism permeated through our home soil. And King knew that, right? He wrote that during a period of war, when a nation becomes obsessed with guns of war, social programs inevitably suffer, right? And I can't help but think of the ramifications that the rhetoric of war deployed right here that ties these three evils together. You see, when the insurrectionists stormed the Capitol on January 6th, it too tied them three evils together. For many, it's actually easy to see the racism and the economic exploitation on full display. But if you take a closer look, you can also see the militarism, right? The mobs of white Trump supporters that ransacked the Capitol were met by a notably weak show of force by the Capitol Police. To many of these, right, the acts of violence, officers responded with restraint. One of the first conversations that come out of that moment were about thinking of the stark contrast between how these officers normally were responding to Black Lives Matter protesters compared to what we saw on January 6th. And as we watched, I know I did, right? You know, I didn't necessarily watch in shock because as a historian, I know better to call anything unprecedented, you know, but I watched just frustrated with the police reaction to that insurrection that suggests, as you know, my friend Kelly Carter Jackson puts, when it comes to engaging in violence against the state, white perpetrators have nothing to lose. And that logic is actually built over time. And so when King powerfully points to people becoming insensitive to pain and agony in their own midst, he had the foresight to see a potential happening like what happened on January 6, 2021, right? Hell, he lived in a day when such an explosion could have been ignited by countless kindlings, right, that surrounded his day-to-day life. But so too have we. We spent the last 20 years conflating the role of police in this country alongside our troops under the language of heroism.
And
right?
it is
And his essence,
to our educational institutions as
absolutely,
our students in public.
right, absolutely, right? Like Howard Bryant writes this in his essay Propaganda. He says the police became a fixture of our national identity in a post 9/11 America. Under the guise of freedom and safety, the land of the free feels occupied by the smothering militarized presence of the police, all presumably to keep us safe. But who feels safe in wartime?
Right. You know, one of the things that I often think about when I hear about King denouncing the Vietnam War is the broader context, right? As a scholar of religion, I think it's important. This fact often gets lost that King's denomination, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, was the first American church to denounce the Vietnam War. Right. And it was a church that was formed in 1961 because King, his father, you know, primary religious leaders like Gardner Taylor and others broke away from the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, because of the autocratic leadership of Joseph H. Jackson, who did not see any role for the church in public life. And so as I think about what happened on January 6th, right, the storming of the Capitol, and as I think about the signs that Jesus saves, and I think about how many in the extreme right are conflating Christianity with white supremacy and white militarism and anti-Black violence, I do ask with Martin Luther King, where is the church? Certainly we see the example of Reverend Barber, and there are others, but I wonder how King would feel today about the American church, Black, white, you name it, the American church, and its institutional courage to actually get involved and denounce what he would interpret as the misappropriation of Christianity in support of white supremacy and white militarism. We just have not seen enough of a public response from the American church to these offenses and abuses.
Across so many of our organized denominations, I think you're absolutely right. And part of what his statement accomplishes is to show the applicability of those religious teachings in every area of advocacy and to strengthen that link between religiosity and activism, because otherwise you are just saying empty words in the most segregated hour a week, every Sunday.
I mean, one of my professors, I don't know for sure if this is correct, said when I was completing my doctoral degree that Martin Luther King Jr. never preached a sermon that was focused on saving souls. I haven't checked, but that stuck with me. You know, for him, Christian identity was authenticated through actively working against systemic injustice. And there's so many Christians who do not align Christian identity with the project of working against systemic injustice, of being courageous and bold and active in public life. So yeah, I mean, we need him more now than ever.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to Carl's point of where is our will? Whether we are looking in the religious sector, whether we are looking in the educational sector, whether we are looking in the public servant sector, where is our will to do right and stand up for what we know is true?
Yeah. And I love that, you know, like some of the listeners out there are probably thinking like, I thought this was about the militarism and thinking about, and, you know, now we're talking about religion and the police. And I'm just like, it's all tied, right? Like, and if anything, you know, that this King's speech and, you know, shows us is that there are just going to be elements of, you know, it's going to be open to the reader to identify its connectedness, right? Whether that means looking at it for a lens of Christianity, or, you know, if anybody does a deep dive into police histories, right, especially since this King's speech, it will reveal that United States police badges have been able to operate without borders or boundaries, right? If that's not the police, I don't know what, or if that's not the military, I don't know what is, right? And so when we're talking about militarism, especially in the 21st century, we have to include conversations about the police, right? We have to include, you know, the way as a nation we think about supporting the police. And you know, we should also consider these internal conflicts, right, as well as these, you know, external conflicts, right? Because again, yes, King is talking about the Vietnam War here, right? And it is a war that, you know, so many Americans were able to kind of come out in public kind of distrust against what are we doing over there, right? They could critique the Vietnam War. In 2021, you can't critique the military. Why?
And that's the deafening silence.
For those who are telling me to keep my mouth shut, I can't do that. I'm against segregation at lunch counters, and I'm not going to segregate my moral concerns. And we must know on some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there are times when you must take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but you must do it because it is right.
I want to thank Professors Stewart, Babb, and Suddler for this wonderful and engaging and timely conversation. I took a bunch of notes, I will tell you that, and I always use these moments as a classroom. And I have we've gotten questions from our viewers, so I want to ask a couple of those if you all don't mind, if I have permission to ask those, and then ask for some closing remarks as well. And I just want to put this out there. One of the things I would ask, I know that the three evils that King referenced are still relevant today. One of the questions I would ask, though, is if we could expand that list, what else would we include on it? And so I'm going to sit that back in the background for us to talk after I ask what our viewers have asked. So the first question is, how can pop culture shift if media and entertainment are celebrations of the facts of capitalism made to sell and advertise materialism to the masses? So that's the first question.
Well,
And
since
anyone can answer.
yeah. I guess that falls to me a bit. I'm thinking again about how throughout this discussion, we identified intersections. And I don't think you can talk about what we see on the media without talking about capitalistic interest. And while the media is a capitalistic concern, it's going to be nearly impossible to do that. But having said that, a lot of other arenas are growing up. Artists are finding ways to express themselves through other technologies than movies, television, and radio. And I think if we can support that, if we can let those new technologies take root, we can also let new voices take root. One of the pluses, I think, of this COVID moment is that it has forced us to rethink what we do and how we do it. We are seeing museums thinking about how to live stream. We are seeing theaters thinking about how to live stream. And by live streaming, you have the capacity to reach a broader audience and to perhaps give them food that is not the kind of junk food we tend to have on our usual media outlets. That said, I think there's also the onus on those usual media outlets to rethink what they do. And they do that when it's to their own interests. Never have I seen so many Black female models on the cover of magazines as I did this summer. Will that last till next year? Probably not. And then the question becomes why? Because you are still selling the same amount of magazines. So it's not even a question of self-interest. It's a question of vision. It's a question of will. So I think our established media can do so much more. I think it will not hurt them to do that so much more. And they really do need to start thinking about that.
Yes. Professor Suddler, Professor Stewart, would you like to comment as well?
I mean, so when you issued the question, the first thing I thought was, I am wearing an MLK shirt that was sold to me by the Atlanta Hawks, right? Now, with that being said, you know, and you can make the case about like where sports kind of fits in this broader conversation about media, pop culture, capitalism. You know, so many of us can also look to the Atlanta Hawks as sort of an example of how to put your money where your mouth is, right? If that is a matter of, you know, Lloyd Pierce's leadership to make sure they were using State Farm Arena as a voting site for the election, right? The Hawks have been kind of regularly present with various kind of like food initiatives in and around the city, in and around Fulton County. But what worries me, and you know, and I think Professor Babb hits this right on the head as well, is about the sustainability, right? Like much of this, you know, that we see with the Hawks is under the leadership of a Black head coach, right, who has made so many of these issues central. And his players are, he has a relatively young team, and his players are responding to that energy in a particular kind of way. But what if he doesn't win games? Right, that bottom line then enters the conversation. And what if Lloyd Pierce goes? What then does what position do the Hawks then play? Right? What happens if Lloyd Pierce, as one of the few Black NBA coaches, is replaced by, say, a white NBA coach? Do these players want to don MLK jerseys the same way? Right? Do they want to be committed to the issues in the same way? And so much of it, again, has to be proven beyond this moment and sort of a sustained systemic effort, if in fact we're going to see any kind of change there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would just add that with the hope and encouragement of this new moment, which has been paved through bloodshed in many respects, how will we sustain it? I mean, that's the fear. How will we sustain it? And how will we keep the attention on systemic changes that benefit those at the bottom, right? Not just the few that can make it through, but those at the very bottom. So yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more.
Yes, and I think also too, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, for lack of a better phrase, I think is widening. Things are getting very complex. I think the pain that exists in that gap, how we close that is going to be an interesting dialogue that we see. I'm learning that, having just moved to Atlanta less than 2 years ago, and the interesting conversations people have around that gap. Wealth, Black wealth and Black poverty, and poverty and wealth, period, and how gentrification undergirds some of those conversations. And so I think, and also what I'm also finding out is King's own complex relationship with capitalism. And he has made those statements. We're going to talk about that later on this week with Maggie Anderson in our MLK lecture about that part of his journey and evolution as a leader in the movement for not only economic justice, but just human rights and social justice. So the other question I would ask along those lines that came in, and I'm going to frame it because the viewer said prosperity preaching and the silence around other things. So I don't know how we want to frame this, but I don't know if anyone wants to think about when you think of the church and the messages that may be coming from the pulpit. There was this prosperity movement and is around that. How would kings see that? I think in some interesting ways. In the civil rights movement, what would that look like? Prosperity preaching, and then the silence around other issues or the uncomfortableness around other issues.
You know, there are people who have linked prosperity gospel ideas to the Jesus of the Bible. How that can be done, I absolutely cannot understand. And that's why, you know, even though my own research focuses extensively on the import of African civilizations to African diaspora religious cultures and expressions, I am committed to consistently teaching in my Black Christian thought course, theological method and hermeneutics. It's absolutely important. I'm about to teach my first class on Black Christian thought this semester. I haven't taught it since 2014, but one of the things I'm going to say to the students is that this nation needs you to have theological literacy. This nation needs you to be able to engage in public conversations about the Bible and about theology in an intelligent and informed manner. And so what prosperity gospel is prominent and widespread because we are a capitalistic nation. In many respects, right? But the challenge to prosperity gospel can only come if we find ways to educate the American public more effectively about the Bible and scriptural interpretation and theological interpretation. There's a real difference, there's a stark difference between many of the popular theologies that have reigned in American history and official Christian theology, which still has been heavily critiqued by Black theologians and womanist theologians and others. But you know, you don't find in an intellectual legacy of theological construction a focus on, for example, the curse of Ham. These are popular theologies that reigned in America and around the world to justify colonialism, racism, and slavery. The only way to challenge this kind of preaching, prosperity preaching, and bad theology, bad scriptural interpretation, proof texting, is to find ways to educate the American public about Christian history, about biblical hermeneutics, about theological method. And that's why I'm so committed to continuing to teach it. When I ask students, how many of you are familiar with the kind of theology that one might associate with a Jerry Falwell? Everybody raises their hand. When I ask, how many of you are familiar with a kind of theology that would be associated with James Cone, a Black theology? Almost no one has heard of it. Almost no one has heard of it. So why? And I think given what's happening with religion in the public square, with the way Christianity and the Bible are being deployed in the public square, especially by the Christian right, we're in a time of urgency to challenge those kinds of hermeneutical traditions with grounded liberation perspectives. And I'm very concerned about the fact that during the lead up to the runoff election, between Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock, very concerned about the manner in which her surrogates were presenting James Cone's Black liberation theology, right? And Raphael Warnock's tie and connection to a Jeremiah Wright. My goodness, when I listened to that sermon from the Obama days, when I listened to that sermon for the first time, I thought, I mean, there might have been one or two things I wouldn't have said, but I thought, boy, could Jeremiah Wright just go a little bit further here? Can he, I mean, he was absolutely right about America's history of internal colonialism, but where I wanted him to go was to critique that legacy in the Bible itself, and that's the problem, to critique the fact that the Bible has a legacy of colonialism as well, right? And so, we need our theologians, we need our biblical scholars to stand up, to find ways to use new media. And some of them are doing it, podcasts and other platforms to educate the American public.
I just want to add the example that one of my students' favorite segments in a course that I teach is looking at how the Bible has been used to justify enslavement. And across denominations, they are just amazed at the way people have been able to manipulate that. So I think you're absolutely right there, Dianne. I just want to also throw in that I think the other problem with prosperity gospel or positive thinking, or this overly optimistic way that the United States frames itself, is that it leads to self-blame and failures. If economic conditions, educational conditions somehow go against you, it is your fault. So I think there's also a kind of danger in very economic, very real ways to that prosperity thinking, and to teach prosperity or to preach prosperity without allowing people access to the tools to achieve it is just morally corrupt.
Yes. Yes, and we could spend we could do a whole segment on this part, because while you all were talking, I was thinking of Baldwin and MLK, James Baldwin, and theology and how it's social empowerment. And we could go on about how the church and how it's being framed in this current moment for a new generation, and how the intergenerational interpretation of prosperity preaching, there is one. And what would have been said and not said in the 1950s and from a pulpit is being said in 2021 about economics, monies, wealth, and all of that, and what's demonstrated. And so we might have to come back to that conversation. I would enjoy that one, because I think it's one that needs to be had. And because I'm a James Baldwin, James Cone, MLK, and I think this, going back to this, I don't think people really understand how revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr. was, even in his day, preaching what he was preaching, because you'd have to see the resistance from his colleagues to that, which is why he was in jail writing the letter from Birmingham jail. I mean, we could talk about that, but my colleagues are asking other questions, which I think are fabulous. So I'm going to ask those. And I want to thank you all for that. And it's so nice to have this intellectual wealth in this space. So a question comes across from Joy Knowles, who asks, will you speak to the common comparison between MLK and Malcolm X? People often praise King for being a nonviolent advocate who is less radical than Malcolm X. Do you feel like this comparison is somewhat founded or a drastic oversimplification?
I'll jump in on this one. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I think this is, where history matters, right? And, why I think it's so important for us to never freeze any one person in one particular time. I think about, actually in a sports history class, I know a lot of people just recently watched One Night in Miami, but there's actually a really good book called titled Blood Brothers by a historian named Johnny Smith, who actually talks about Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali's friendship in general, right? Like how it came to be, how Muhammad came to that kind of moment, right? That pivotal moment in Miami where, it becomes public that he was going to become a member of the Nation of Islam, right? But leading up to that book, one thing that I often try to do in my class is I take quotes, one from MLK, one from Malcolm, without, attributing them to either. And I trick my students on purpose every time, right? Like, who said this, right? And it seems very nonviolent until they're going to be like, Martin, and it was Malcolm, right? Who said this, right? And I just do it, and they catch on pretty quickly. It doesn't take very long for them to catch on to see what I'm doing, but that's why I think it's so important for us to kind of read beyond what's actually given to us, right? One of the things that I was really excited about this session about was we were reading a King speech that was relatively lesser known. I certainly we could you could put a group of really smart people in a room to talk about the I Have a Dream speech. And you can talk about it in very in-depth ways, because even that speech is frozen in a way, right, that has been kind of fed to us to think of, we're ignoring the color of the skin and, paying more attention to the content of character, right? But it actually doesn't get into kind of his broader critiques of capitalism that he even offers in that speech, right? And so, so I guess, to answer the question more directly, is it an oversimplification? If we take any one person, right, and freeze them in a moment, it can always be an oversimplification, right? But people change, right? King lived a life after Malcolm's death that was drastically different than the one that he led up to, right? There's no discounting what the death of Malcolm X or what the assassination of Malcolm X actually meant to King as a person. And and these are the types of questions, the types of relationships that we need to be thinking about.
There's one thing I'd also like to add to that, and it does stress your point about we have to read and know history. This is the latest in a long line of these kind of artificial divisions. If we look at Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnet, if we look at W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and now we get to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, it is, I think, extremes that are imposed for the purposes of others. General society can say, oh, this is who you should be like, not this. But I also think they can be useful if we internalize it to look at our own history and the development of our own thought. Each of these voices can crystallize different ways Black people have thought about their experiences in the United States. And when you look at one, then look at the other, a conversation happens and illumination happens. So in that sense, I think they can be very useful and instructive.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly where I was going. I mean, this either or approach is not helpful at all. I often start some of my classes telling my students, I'm teaching at Emory because of Martin Luther King, but I'm teaching Black studies because of Malcolm X. We need both of them. And it's not an either or a choice. I mean, that's incredibly simplistic. Yeah, I think in many respects, we're always looking for our comfort zone with these powerful activists who loved America, who loved Black people, and were willing to give their life for its enhancement, for the enhancement of this nation and the people of this nation. We're always looking for a comfort zone. But I ask, what is it about them and their thought that challenges us most when we look at them in their complexity and their nuance? One of the things I love about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X is that neither were willing to be held back by ideology. And you see that in their growth. That's why Malcolm X had to leave the Nation of Islam. No matter how it happened, he just would have had to, because he could not be fenced in by ideology. And I think studying both of them, their growth, their expansion, their openness to learn from their own mistakes, I think is a call for us to do that same kind of reflection and to ask if we're willing to be truth seekers beyond the box of ideology. Many of us are not, and many of us have been educated to be comfortable with ideologies that privilege us the most rather than truth seekers.
Indeed. And I think you also are pointing to all of you how there's always been a divide conquer mentality, which is if we can pit one against another, we focus more on that division than the fact that both of them were moving towards liberation for Black people. And they just had a different method of how to do that. And in many ways, they came together in some ways, the closer they were getting, evolving in their lives. Many will say Malcolm and Martin changed spaces, but what I really think is they just evolved as people and had experiences, and this is where they are. It had to be painful. Going back to something Professor Suddler said, I can't imagine what Reverend Dr. King's view was as he was watching those who were in the struggle with him die, and also knowing that there was an expiration on his day. I don't to, and these were young people. When I say young, he was 39. Malcolm was not much older. I really, it baffles me how what we focus on and not the humanity of those people who at the ultimate cost paved the way for me to sit here and have this conversation very comfortably in a home while they were out there in the street trying to get us the basic human rights and dignity. So thank you for that question. I have two more. One of them, Reverend Barber speaks of the four evils, I guess. I don't know of this, so I'm just asking the question because it was here. If anyone remembers Reverend Barber asking, it says Reverend Barber speaks of the four, and it says racism, poverty, materialism, militarism, and there's a question mark, interconnected areas. What is the last one? Did someone mention Reverend Barber and the four areas? I don't recall that one.
Oh, I had just mentioned that he is an example, his particular movement is an example of the kind of institutional courageous leadership that this nation needs to see from more Christian institutions. And so I think in pulling those four evils together, he is continuing Martin Luther King's legacy. He's continuing the best of the tradition of Black liberation theology and broader liberation theologies. So yes, I think he is a shining example, and I think it's encouraging. It's important that he was asked to participate in the inaugural events. Symbolically, I think that's important that we have what I would call a liberation theologian doing this work, playing this role, rather than a typical evangelical theologian, right? I mean, when it comes down to it, certainly there is, what many in my field have called the priestly responsibilities of the pastor, of the church, right, to attend to the internal and spiritual needs of the congregation. But there is a public role for the church, not to mention the white church's historical entanglement and participation in slavery and colonialism and other systemic and structural forms of evil. So there's a responsibility not only to repent, to acknowledge and repent of those sins, but to continue to be an institution that bears witness to what Martin Luther King would have called the beloved community, what Reverend Barber continues to seek and to call people to participate in the forming of that beloved community. So yes, I would just say that Barber is a very important example of the courage and the ethical position that we need to see many more Christian institutions take in America today, right now.
Right now. All right, our last question. MLK Day is often a time when folks post blips, and I'm reading this question directly, from Dr. King's speeches, seemingly to promote a respectability politic within the racial justice movement. How do we undo the mystical King notion in our praxis? And I think you all spoke to that, but I'm going to give you a few minutes to speak to that again of undoing King. And one is, I think, starting with what Professor Suddler said, which is to get the March on Washington right. I mean, folks only say March on Washington, but it's March on Washington, I think, for freedom and jobs. I mean, there's a whole title to that thing. And he starts about the check. I mean, he goes into the speech talking about the insufficient funds of checks that were supposed to be cashed. So I'll ask that question and allow you all to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is, to be the historian of like history matters, right? But also beyond that, right? To your point about the March on Washington, to not only know that yes, it's the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, but also that A. Philip Randolph, as a labor organizer, threatened to do a March on Washington during World War II as well, right? And the threat was enough for an executive order to come down to desegregate military industries, right? Home industries in the United States. And so this tactic in and of itself, this organizing in and of itself was actually part of a longer radical labor tradition. And if we think about the positionality of unions and who was kind of getting involved here, right? It allows us to have these separate conversations, right? Even through something like King's speech. But beyond that, in terms of the positionality of respectability politics, certainly I think, if in fact somebody is reading the room and looking at something that King says as, they're trying to advance some sort of respectable politic figure or framing, you should ask yourself why, right? Because any kind of digging of what went on at the, again, I don't want to beat on the "I have a dream" speech, right, too much, right? But any kind of digging of that moment, you realize that there was a particular image, right, and that's something of the evolution that happens over time, right? Whether you kind of get into the fight and the tussle on like respectability politics or not, there's a particular image that is important to convey at different moments in history at different times, right? Whether that's the right decision or not, you have to understand that that was a active decision, right? There were people who were slated to speak at the March on Washington that were denied their opportunities because their speeches were seen in particular light, right? And so I do think, instead of, getting into this tiff on, respectability politics has held us back for too long, you understand and try to make sense out of why is it that, we are constantly put in a position where some of our messages have to be conveyed in particular lights, right? Why is it that, image and ideas, and typically that answer is going to get us back to the three evils, right? Because of racism, capitalism, and militarism, right? And so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
I keep thinking of Audre Lorde's statement, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house,"
Mm-hmm.
when I think about respectability politics. And I think it is imperative that we do understand the constraints that these early activists were under. They were constantly being viewed through an external gaze that would represent not just their actions, but what was the meaning of being Black for all people in the United States. So I think that is part of where respectability politics comes from. And I also do think, though, we have to start to learn to ignore that. Another commonplace saying that I like quite a bit is that both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were assassinated while wearing suits. So how much does respectability politics actually gain for us in this modern time? One of the things I like about the Black Lives Matter movement is the attempt to go away from that, go away from this concept of a messiah, a single leader, and have a more grassroots generation of activism that incorporates all manner of expressions, all manners of what I will say are respectable politics because they are arguing for the end of impoverishment, ignorance, and militarism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would just add that, you know, as I heard the question about how to implement the authentic king or the non-mythical king into our praxis, I think it's important when I think about praxis as it relates to Christians, we were just talking about that, for Christian organizations, Christian churches, and others to really be willing to move from charity to systemic change, right? It's not okay to stop at charity, and charity can be problematic at times, because it can often be engaged in with the belief that there is some sort of systemic change that's being accomplished. So I think it's important to think about how committed Martin Luther King Jr. was to systemic change, to structural change. And that requires a level of involvement that is beyond good acts, doing kind acts or doing good acts. So that's how I understand praxis out of the liberation theological tradition, especially.
To extend that comment too, because it expands beyond doing Black History Month activities, beyond doing diversity activities as well. The hardest thing to change is an institution. And I applaud Emory for doing things such as this, but we really do have to think about more systemic ways to change an institution. Is there some way in which we can facilitate working with secondary school teachers, elementary school teachers, so that the education that all of us have cited as being so important becomes more widespread? What are those practices, as you're pointing out, Dianne, that we can really examine and rethink?
Yes, and I think it starts in our classrooms, even here at Emory. I mean, we can look at our curriculum to find out where is King situated in the curriculum? Is he in the Department of Economics to talk about economic justice? Is his writings or Malcolm's writings or any of those? I mean, I think how it's interwoven, not just in African American studies, but I'm thinking in the disciplines writ large, how beyond the pedagogy or how to reimagine pedagogical approaches to disciplines that expand that view from individuals who may not have an economics degree, but were very in tune with what it meant to live on the other end of and experience the impact of economic policies or the lack thereof. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a moment where I think we're all having to rethink how we approach and what we do and how we educate even ourselves as practitioners, but then how we engage our students in that work to innovate and create. So I could not agree with you more. So we keep getting these fascinating questions. So I'm gonna keep asking them until we run out of time. So this one says, how do we continue MLK's fight against the evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy and militarism that are persistent, pervasive, and perpetuated by a distorted moral narrative that must be challenged? What a question. I had to read it like that because that's how it came. So how do we continue King's fight? And I think really is, how do we continue King's fight based on all of those systems? And we know that the systems are persistent, pervasive, and are perpetuated by this moral lens or moral narrative that in some ways fuels the ability to activate these systems, or these systems are activated by that. And how do we challenge that?
Yeah, I think we challenge it by asking so many of the questions that we were trying to pose here, right? I think central to so much of the conversation is, what is the system in systemic racism, right? What is the system in, that we're actually combating, right? And again, I don't like to say I ever have the answer, but an answer is potentially white supremacy, right? And so we have to acknowledge it and address it and call it out as such, right? So one thing that I, often try to get my, students to do in the classroom, but even beyond, right? So much of what many of us in the field, and when I say in the field, I'm talking about African American history broadly, but I'm also just thinking about more specifically, folks invested in changing narratives around like the carceral state. So understanding kind of the growing of, and the impact of incarceration is something that I think King would also be fighting against, with so many other people fighting against it today, is that, if in fact, like we need to know what we're up against, right? To Professor Babb's point earlier, systems do not, get taken down without any resistance, right? The resistance is actually going to come from the system as well. But then, it just returns me to the question that I started off with. What is the system, right? Like, what is said system? And, I think, so much of answering that question actually requires an internalization of all of our roles in it as well. And what then can we do, right? So if the question is, how do we change it? We question, we reflect, and we respond.
Mhm.
And I'm becoming more and more convinced that collaboration, particularly outside institutions, are necessary. That those of us who have had the privilege of education, those of us who have had the privilege of access, have to reach beyond our halls of privilege and converse with, work with those who have not. And I think that brings us back to the knowledge that you're saying that we need to acquire, Carl, because that is actually where we get it. So I think I'm trying to envision how to answer that larger question through action rather than through thought.
Mm. It also makes me wonder about the role of the public intellectual. And I also applaud Emory for moving to a place of supporting public intellectualism among its faculty. Because when I think, Carl, about the impact of someone like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I mean, that book has reached so many spaces and places in America that our standard scholarship to members of our discipline would never reach. So I do think there is a role for us to play, as Valerie said, in spreading our knowledge, but in venues and through platforms and fora that allow us to explore our potential as public intellectuals. And what I've learned is I just published a book that was that's for public facing, and what I've learned through all the podcasts that I've been on is that there are, as Valerie said before, many people who are doing this kind of work, who are using the media in very constructive and productive ways. I'm actually just seriously encouraged and impressed by what I've learned, the number of podcasts that I've learned about, and the high quality of discourse that's going on these podcasts, in part because of the very good and well circulating public scholarship that many of our colleagues are doing. So I think information, being properly informed and even civically engaged at the local and national levels, requiring our public servants to know what our concerns are and to respond to them at local and national levels will be important. And so being informed about how to do that is important. And we have a number of activist groups that are working on that. And of course, the internet and digital media, all of that helps us, all the petitions that go across the internet and all the campaigns that are being carried out on the internet. We have even more tools at our disposal today to be effective.
Can I hop in really quick on that note about public intellectualism? Something that I often try to do as well is, get people to question the position of public intellectuals and their role, in the sense of like Michelle Alexander's work is phenomenal, right? Michelle Alexander's work came out 10 years ago, and it's important for us to understand that what she meant to a field that I'm, very much involved in, is also kind of grown and changed and reshaped over time, right? And something that so many of us in that field are forced to kind of combat is sort of just, that effect, right? And what that effect actually means, right? And I use Michelle Alexander here, not necessarily as the example, but as an example of what it means to then teach a class on mass incarceration in which every one of your students comes in with the premise, mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. And I say that as sort of a heat of warning or potential like limits to what we do with the public intellectuals that are kind of put forward while the expense of so many others at the margins, right? That is, if in fact we have conversations in 2021 about anti-racism, there are certain public intellectuals that become that face.
Mhm.
And there are people who have been committed to anti-racist scholarship long before, who have been marginalized by not only the academy, but also by the public, right? And so it's important for us to question, what is it about this moment and this person and this work, right, that has guided or that has led in this kind of way, right? Because so much of that can also lead us back to a moment like King and realize, what is it about certain King messages that become public kind of that become acceptable on a public space, right? Because we can ask those questions about work around, mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow. We can certainly ask those questions around the anti-racist scholarship that was put out and that really capitalized on kind of this moment in this summer. And I think much of that is, that while I think we should read it, we should be familiar, we should engage, we should also really sit with the questions as to why them and why when, right? Because I think thinking about that, will make sense, will help us make sense of, to your example, Dianne, about like why somebody like Falwell's liberation is known and Combs isn't, right? It kind of is that age-old moment that, what we determine becomes mainstream, even in public intellectualism, is as political as anything else, right?
And I think I actually define public intellectualism as just the opposite, as being able to be a conduit to multiple voices, not selecting the current talking head, the current publication, and making people aware of what you are saying, the importance of history, knowing that, yes, this book may be hot right now, but it has come on the shoulders of many, 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 many other books doing all kinds of broad research. So it's, I think it's very important not to take 3 or 4 representatives and put them forward, but as a public intellectual to show all of the voices, all of the contexts that produce particular sets of thought.
Yeah, and I think just to add to bring us to a close, and I'll ask for final reflections here. I think it also speaks to what our roles become as educators for those who don't have the privilege to sit in our classrooms, and what is the bridge we build, because between the public, and I'm saying those who are the larger, my grandmother, where she living, or my mom, who is not at Emory or in an institution of higher learning, those uncles who didn't rub elbows with us, but are listening on a podcast, are tuned in to NPR, and so how do we as public intellectuals, what is our responsibility at this current moment when facts are being reinvented as we sit? Based on, I don't know what their criteria is, but where things, where what we know as truth is being warped and reimagined and reframed, I think it's important that engagement of the public in the intellectual life of our world, our society. I think it's more crucial now than ever, around those dinner tables, in those walks in the park with our children, with our siblings. And so with that said, I would like, if you will, because I think a lot of questions, I want to thank our viewers. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This has been marvelous. It fed my soul. I want to say that. The mind is racing. I'm thinking, ooh, how can I use some of this in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion? I'm always thinking that, the scholar, because we're lifelong learners. Our audience is probably wondering, so what do I do? What do I do from my position? How can I, maybe I'm a staff member, maybe I'm an administrative assistant, maybe I'm not a student in the classroom. So, and King was so brilliant at touching the lives of all people. He really tried to break down certain statuses, if you will. If you were a drum major for justice, if you want to be a street sweeper, be the best one you can where you are in that space. So I would ask my three wonderful scholars here, how would you encourage people to use King's message as fuel for their work in this current moment? Because we didn't even mention COVID-19 and what would King say about COVID right now? I mean, I think he'd have something to say on, race and policing and all of that, because that hasn't changed. But how can we encourage our listeners to be activated? How can we activate them? What would you say? You can activate them any way you choose, but I always like to end on a note of inspiration, a charge to do work, no matter where you are. So what would be given what we just spoken about, the three evils, and the persistence of them, even in this current moment, where can we, in our positionality, and I think you all spoke to this, how do you move from words and thinking to action? What would you leave for our viewers? So I'll start with Professor Stewart, move to Professor Suddler, and then end with Professor Babb.
Thank you. First, I would just say that knowledge is power and knowledge transforms. I've seen it for over 20 years in the classroom. I've seen it in the things that my students have gone out to do. I've often said jokingly in the classroom that, Obama wasn't elected in 2008 because of many of the things people think. He was elected because of me and all of my colleagues in African American studies that have been teaching all these young white liberals who were pounding the pavement. I mean, in many respects, Obama was going to get much of the Black vote, right? But it's those young white students that were sitting in our African American studies classes. They certainly weren't, in most cases, getting the information and the knowledge from around the dinner table, right? They were getting it from these African American studies classes. They were being transformed about how they understood the history of their nation, how they understood the history of racial struggle and racial justice and other struggles for justice in America through many of the classes they were taking in African American studies. So I firmly believe in when I talk with, for example, the Mellon students, who in this time are often conflicted about the pursuit of scholarship alongside or juxtaposed with their investment in activism. I constantly tell them that there is a scholarly activism, that teaching and helping students to uncover facts, as you have said, about the past and to think about them, reflect on them intelligently, and to think about what they mean for us today is important. So I would first say that that the Emory staff person, the person listening now, the person listening now who's going to be talking to someone tonight at dinner, should seek knowledge, should seek to know, to become informed. How many people really know that African Americans did not receive that 40 acres and a mule, while millions of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of white Americans were receiving free land? How many people really know that? How many people really know that that first Homestead Act in 1862 was happening right at the time when all of these transitions were supposed to be happening for African Americans? So I think information, credible information, seeking credible information will lead to transformation of the person, who is seriously empathetic, and therefore to perhaps the meetings of minds to come up with an action plan. We can't take action if we don't know history, if we don't know the situations that we're in, right? So I would say seeking knowledge, new knowledge, is one of the most important things we could do at this moment.
Thank you.
And so I'll say quickly two things, right? Because I often have these conversations. The first thing would be you are who you are, right? You know, you're not a bomb thrower. You value friendship over allyship, collaboration over partisanship, civility over cruelty, and you've used space time and time again to argue repeatedly for those things. Not everyone is going to agree that you've made the right decisions, or that these approaches that you may take are the right ones. So you'll need to acknowledge those problems and acknowledge that the problems of the present are big enough to require all sorts of solutions, right? Not everyone cares about these issues, will agree with you in your approach. And you know what? That's fine, right? You'll just need to make sure that the effective approaches you care about aren't understood as a more reasonable alternative. The second thing is, I would say, give up on no one. Right? It's radical enough to suggest these days that every vote counts, but every person counts too, right? Don't give up on a bigger public that craves understanding. Don't simplify. Don't assume that a rural, poor, or working class people can't understand complexity. Don't assume that Wall Street bankers can't learn, right? Don't let a bad joke go without a response, but also don't let a question go unanswered. So you are who you are. Give up on no one.
All right.
So sorry. King is a wonderful example, but the other great example were the foot soldiers, the people who made meals, the people who made mimeographs, the people who combined money to go bail people out of jail. And I think what I have come to realize is that I am a foot soldier. So systems, institutions are humongous. And I think we have to find individual ways that we can begin to shift them, to chip away at them. My particular answer is to have contacted, and sadly, COVID kind of put a huge stop on this, but to have contacted teachers in my local school district and offered my services to come talk to their classes, to join them on field trips or whatever. And I hope to rebuild that once we are out of this particular moment. But it's a sense of what my grandmother used to say, bloom wherever you are planted, wherever you can find a means of interjecting, interject. And don't think that it has to be that global answer that would change the world by tomorrow.
Yes, and I'll add to that. Thank you all so much for that. One of the questions was asking, what is the legacy and responsibility at Emory and of how we do this? And I think, you know, we begin with our mission, which is to create, cultivate, apply, and preserve knowledge in the service of humanity. So it's an understanding where your role is in that. One of the things I can say is, you know, King's role was that of servant leader, and to the point that he gave his life for that. And he started in his circle of influence. So to answer this question, and, you know, Emory taking stock of its own complicity in some processes, to have real conversation and then to eliminate, to address barriers of access, of curricular bondage that does not allow us to stretch our minds to address our most pressing concerns. If we want to know what Emory's responsibility, Emory is the institution, the people in it make that institution. And so the responsibility starts with us in our circle of influence to move this conversation forward. Those are some of the hard conversations I have with folks. We like to point back. What's Emory doing? Yes, we have policies, we have practices, known and unknown, these amorphous things that we do that hover over how we begin to come together as a community. But I always say, let me start with me. What is my responsibility in that conversation, in that dialogue? And then how can I then build bridges with those who are sojourning with me on this journey to enact change? And I think that's, if King were here, he would say, yes, change begins with me. If I'm going to say I'm a drum major for justice, then what drum am I beating? And what is the tune that I'm playing to? So that would be kind of putting that and tying up all of what we've said here today. So again, I thank you, Professor Stewart, Professor Suddler, Professor Babb. Emory is so blessed and fortunate to have each of you here, educating not only the next generation, but our current generation and those yet to be that will be admitted here. I want to thank again Nicole Ingram and Jessica Jones for assisting us in creating this opportunity for dialogue. And I thank each of you all for tuning in, for listening, and may you be inspired to walk into your own destiny and live out your own purpose in creating this beloved community that King sought to create. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.